Well, welcome everybody to tonight's lecture, which is part of a new series hosted by the Bentley Library on the history of the University of Michigan. My name is Gary Krenz. I'm Director for Post-Bicentennial Planning at the Bentley Library. I'll spare you the jokes I usually attach to that title, but in any case, appreciate your joining us this November evening. I had the pleasure and the privilege of directing the planning for the university's bicentennial, which many of you know is in 2017. And I think the bicentennial demonstrated a couple of things. First, that exploring Michigan's deep and rich history with its many constituencies, cross-cutting currents, profound, exciting, and sometimes troubling episodes is enlivening and enlightening. And second, that understanding our history helps us expand our sense of community, sometimes by celebrating our institutional achievements, sometimes by bringing to light achievements and struggles by those whose stories have been obscured, and sometimes by helping us see more clearly our own everyday experience in comparison and contrast with the experience of our predecessors. So this lecture series is part of our effort to continue that exploration. I hope you'll be able to join us for many of the talks this year. And there are on the table just outside, there is a list of all of the lectures if you'd like to see what's coming up. Now for tonight's talk. We are fortunate to have with us Lisa Young, who will speak on lily stalks, pounded Murphys, and caramel ice cream. We're going to have Q&A later, but I know the question on everybody's mind is, why would you pound a Murphy and what happens when you do? So I assume we'll get the answer to that question. You can read Lisa's bio in the program, but I just want to mention a few highlights. She is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology and a research affiliate of the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology. She also serves as University Associate for the Arizona State Museum at University of Arizona. Her archaeological research explores variation and change in small-scale farming communities, especially in the southwestern U.S. She is involved in research and support of local food systems. And in recent years, she has taught a seminar for first-year students called Food at the University of Michigan, Then and Now, which in many ways underpins tonight's talk. In that course, her students utilized resources of the Bentley Historical Library and the Janus Bluestein Langone Culinary Archive in the UM Special Collections Library. So please join me in welcoming Lisa Young.
Okay, Gary, I'm on wireless too, right? Can you all hear me okay? All right, great. Good. Thank you very much for coming out on this cold night. So I'm going to take a little bit of different lens on U of M history, and that is to think of it through food. And as Gary mentioned, I'm an archaeologist. So what am I doing thinking about the history of U of M food as an archaeologist? And just to give you a little context, I am also one of the faculty within the U of M Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. And when the bicentennial came up, that coalition of faculty and staff said, it'd be great to teach a class on food and in the context of the bicentennial. And then they needed somebody to teach it. And they said, Lisa, do you want to do it? And I said, yeah, I'll do it. In part because I was already teaching a local food class and learning about food at U of M and sustainability and thinking about history. But then I had to face the reality of teaching the class and thinking about how was I going to learn about history of food and what resources was I going to use, because I really wanted to introduce the students to as many resources as possible on the University of Michigan that dealt with food. And then I thought, I'm in this sustainable food systems cross-disciplinary group. What do I have to offer as an archaeologist? So I'd like to start off with my perspective on food as an archaeologist, and then take you through sort of the development of some of my ideas and share with you some of the historical research that I'm now doing with this first year seminar, and we're actively in year 2 of that class. So students are still doing the research. This is very much a work in progress. And if there are any people here who are culinary historians, I would love your input on this project, because I feel like I've dipped my toe into something that's very much broader. There will be places in this talk where I need you to participate too, because one of my teaching philosophies is active learning. So please get ready to participate in this. All right, so I am an archaeologist, and an archaeologist who thinks about food and small-scale farming communities. My home base for my research is the American Southwest, and this is what we usually find. This is a pile, you can't see it very well, but of burned corn. And so this tells us what people ate. So that's interesting to know what people ate, but we know that people in the Southwest have been eating corn for over 2,000 years. So my interests are not only what they ate, but how did they prepare it? How did they preserve it? How did they produce it? And so we need to look beyond, as a friend of mine calls this, the burned bits of prehistory, to other things that we find. And so here's an example of a mano and metate that's being used in an experimental setting. So this is how corn is being ground prehistorically. And a friend of mine was doing experiments to understand that process of grinding, and does different corn grind in different ways? And if you use different materials, does it grind the corn in different ways? Okay, so we know they ground corn. And then the beauty of working in the Southwest is we have descendants of the ancestral population still living in that area. And many times they still have a lot of their traditional knowledge. And I'm very lucky to work on a state park that has ancestral Hopi sites, Hopi being one of the Native American tribes in northeastern Arizona. And one of the things that we do at this state park, which if you saw the picture of me on the flyer, is we roast corn in a traditional Hopi corn roasting pit. So this is me pulling out the corn. So the reason I'm telling you this is because as an archaeologist, where most of our data is literally garbage, we have to use a wide variety of different information to understand the food and the whole food system that people used in the ancient past. So thinking about, for me, it's thinking about that whole process of how do you go from farm to table. And in the Southwest where I work in the ancient populations, it's a very short journey because the people who are growing the food are also picking the food and processing the food and serving the food. So, but our food system now, that journey is very long. The average distance is over 50, that our food travels is 1,500 miles. And this is one of the things that I ask the students to think about is our food system now. For any of you that will be buying lettuce out of the grocery store for Thanksgiving dinner, that lettuce probably was grown in southern Arizona or Southern California and has been picked and then packaged and transported here. So thinking about that complex journey, what I know as an archaeologist is that system that we have that brings the food to our tables is very new and very different than how people were eating for thousands of years before. And one of the things that I got interested in when I was thinking about U of M history is understanding the sort of incremental changes that brought about the food system that we have now. And one of the things that I was really interested in was thinking about what my students' great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents would have been doing had they been here as students. What would the farm to table have been like then? And we know that in the early 1900s that farms were very small and very diverse. And then this is a picture from one of the scrapbooks from a banquet in 1904. I don't know where the banquet was, and it's actually from a scrapbook where he also went to high school here in Ann Arbor, so it may be part of that. But it's a banquet. You can see actually lots of men in this banquet tables, and they're laid out with the food, and there's people in the background that are serving too. So how did we go through this journey from farm to table over 100 years ago? What was that journey like? And part of the reason I picked that time period is there's so many interesting things happening in the food system at the time or about to just change. Some new foods that were exciting to people were things like canned pineapple, which first started to be shipped out canned and shipped out from Hawaii in the late 1800s. Henry Ford was just developing his Fordsome tractor and starting to mass produce it, which really changed the mechanization of how small-scale farmers were using tractors and things like that, because it was very, very versatile. Most people were storing their food in ice boxes. Refrigerators were just being invented in the early 1900s and weren't massively in households for a very long time because there were a lot of households that weren't on the electric grid yet. So just a lot of things like that, and as I like to say to my students, no freezers either. If you don't have a refrigerator, you don't have a freezer also. So when you look at what's on the menu, you can't think about freezers. So how do you start this process then of doing research, and how do you start this process of doing research with students in their first weeks at the University of Michigan? And I have to say that the other reason I was inspired to do this project is as a freshman here at the University of Michigan, I took a history class that included food and was talking about capitalism and environmental issues and things like that. And that class really changed my views of how I looked at food. So I wanted to think about a way to help nudge my students in that direction too. So where do you start? Where do you start when you're not a historian, you don't know the historic record of this place? You come to the library and you talk to lots and lots and lots of people. And I thought I would be able to find information like is available from Michigan State, the agricultural college here in our state of Michigan, where they were producing a lot of food on campus, so they had those records. And then they also kept a lot of records of the food that they were purchasing and bringing in. We didn't keep that here at University of Michigan. So I was starting to get a little worried about what I was going to do with the students. And then one of the librarians at the Bentley said to me, "Hey, have you ever seen the scrapbooks?" I said, "I've heard about the scrapbooks, but I've never seen them." She said, "I think they have banquet menus in them." And I went, "Okay, great. So now we can start with the table to understand that food system. We can start with thinking about what students ate." And so one of the things I've been doing is there are hundreds of scrapbooks in the Bentley Library, and I've been, in my free time, it's actually like this game of discovery for me. I come over to the Bentley every once in a while and I ask for a bunch of scrapbooks, and I just thumb through them very rapidly looking for banquet programs. And then I have a database that I've been working on. So I've been through about 50 scrapbooks from the Bentley Library collection, and about 75% of them, the students actually kept banquet programs that all of them have the menus then in them. And they're from, the earliest one that I've seen is 1870s, and then there are some from the 1930s, but I haven't been looking at those because I want to focus on the early 1900s. And so I started going through those, and the other thing I have to say is this looks like a miracle to me as an archaeologist, because this is the material culture that a student from University of Michigan decided to save and organize. So every time I open up one of these scrapbooks, it feels like this sense of discovery, the sort of same thrill I get when I'm in the field, but I can just open the pages and look through it. So they're pretty amazing that way. So what I'll do now is just take you on a little tour of some of the scrapbooks, some of the banquet menus that the students have been looking at, and talk to you about the process, walk you through actually the process of how we go from the table as close as we can back to the farm. Just to think about what that food system was like. And I can't do it exactly, but one of the things that I know with archaeology, what we do with archaeology is we take some information and we make inferences about the past. And so that's what I'm working with the students on. All right, so this is one of the scrapbooks that the students were looking at this year, just a page from the scrapbook. This is Ivor Swift's scrapbook, and I think it's from 1917 or 1918. And it gives you an idea of some of the things that are in the scrapbook. This is actually a very nice banquet program. It's got a leather cover on it and things like that, and it's a Kappa Kappa Gamma banquet program. And then you can see some other typical things. Iva kept a picture of her sisters. She kept a lot of the cards from the sorority. You can just see off the page over there, there's some newspaper clippings, there's other pictures. There's football tickets, there's football programs, there's theater programs. There was a tradition of hair cutting at the University of Michigan that I don't really know the history of, so sometimes there's bits of hair in the scrapbooks. There's little party favors, just anything that students would have kept. And some scrapbooks are really well organized, and some scrapbooks are very disorganized, and some scrapbooks I wonder if mom put them together for the person after they graduated, things like that. I found report cards and things like that. And one of the things that I try to stress with the students is they need to be respectful, because they're sharing somebody's life when they look through these scrapbooks. So we start with the students come to the Bentley, and I've assigned them a scrapbook, and they start looking through it and looking for the banquet menus. And some scrapbooks have 1 or 2 banquet menus. I'd say the average is 3 or 4, and some have as many as 19. Some people really liked to keep the programs from the banquets they went to, so there are some compulsive people. But one of the things that we've learned, and the students have analyzed, for the first year seminar, they've analyzed 14 banquet programs, banquet menus, from 12 different students. So we have 2 repeats that were included, because the scrapbooks are really amazing pieces of, scraps of memories. And so this is just to show you some variety. I have many menus from the Women's League. And this is from one of their luncheons. And I don't know about this year, which is 1918, but a couple years before that, they sold out all the tickets, and there were 600 women at this luncheon. Not only students, but also alumni. And this one from 1918 is interesting because the students found an article in the Michigan Daily about this banquet, and it actually listed the price of the tickets. And so for a student, it cost 50 cents, and in 1918, that would be the equivalent of about $7.50 now. And then for alumni, they had to pay a little bit more, and that was 75 cents. It's at the Arbor Gymnasium, which was a large gymnasium that would have held a lot of people. And the menu, the scrapbooks usually have sort of the outside, the menu, and then something about what's going on at the banquet. This one includes toasts, and then there's some speeches and also some songs. So this would be an example of a large banquet that was going on, in a fairly simple menu and a fairly simple meal. And then this is an initiation from Alpha Chi Sigma, a fraternity that is a professional fraternity that focuses on chemical sciences. And for this one, the initiates are in this list right here. So it's a fairly small number of people being initiated into this fraternity. It's quite a fancy program. It's nicely printed. It's got a ribbon. It folds over. These are only a few pages from this banquet program. And actually, I was just looking through the pictures that I took in a little more detail. And Willard Dow was one of the people. That was part of this society at the time, who took over Dow Chemical from his dad. So the banquets can be very small and very elaborate too. Most of the banquets are also a variety of different months while the students are here, but most of them are in February and March. All right. So we know what students were eating based on the menus. So let's look at what's on the menu and start to analyze the food. And this is the point where I have to rein back in the students because they're like, what's this in the scrapbook? And I'm like, I don't know, but we're gonna focus on the food. We can learn about the food because otherwise there's so many things. I don't know about the hair cutting traditions. You're gonna have to look that up yourselves. So. Anyway, so here's thinking about what's on the menu, and this is the Kappa Kappa Gamma initiation. And you can see some fairly standard organization to the menu, and that's why I wanted to show this to you. So it usually starts out with some cold dishes, especially celery and olives and sweet pickles are common. Then occasionally you have some grapefruit, and this is probably a grapefruit drink. And I don't know about this, but it seemed like grapefruit drinks at that time, if somebody did a little tweak on them, they put their name at the end of them. And then there's soup. This is a consommé here. And then there's a meat dish. Chicken was very, very common on the banquet menus. The other most common thing is veal. And then there's some lamb and some beef and a little bit of fish. And then you invariably have potatoes and then occasionally some vegetables with that. And then following that, there's a salad. And students were like, what's Waldorf salad? Who's had Waldorf salad? Yeah, me too. I grew up eating Waldorf salad. And they're like, what's Waldorf salad? I was like, you're going to find out because several of the banquets have Waldorf salad on it. Then there's often some sort of bread with that, maybe cheese, maybe nuts, and then dessert. And invariably dessert is ice cream and cake. Many times they do not list the flavors of ice cream, but I have to say caramel was one of the popular flavors when they were listed on the banquet menu, and also we've seen strawberry on the banquet menus too. And then cake. And cake, sometimes it says assorted cakes, and you want to know what flavors they are. Again, it's usually not listed, but I have two examples that I'll share with you tonight where I was so excited when I opened up that banquet menu, and I was like, it lists the kind of cake. It's coconut cake, it's sunshine cake. I'm so excited. So I told the students they had to use that banquet menu. It often ends with coffee. And then as you'll see on many of the menus, especially for the smaller organizations that are hosting the banquets, there's often cigarettes and cigars. And my students were a little bit surprised about that. All right. Other desserts, I just want to say that there's also apple pie, and as you'll see, there's strawberry shortcake on one of the desserts too. One of their popular salad, besides Waldorf salad, is actually a pineapple salad, probably made with canned pineapple and French dressing, which is surprisingly good because I've tried it. I was really skeptical. Okay, we know what the food is now. So now we need to start heading backwards. And the way we do that is we go to special collections. And in special collections, Julie McClune has laid out some period recipe cookbooks for us. And she's the curator of the Culinary Archive. And also, we've started adding in menu books because there were books to help people who were keeping house plan their menus out for the week. And so then what I charge the students with is picking a few things on the banquet menu and then researching how finding a recipe for them, thinking about where they appear on the menus, and sort of doing that next step back to think about food preparation. And one of the things with the menu books I asked them to think about is, were some of these items also on specialty menus? Do they show up on the Christmas menus? Do they show up on the Thanksgiving menus? And one of the things that I've been interested in is that ice cream shows up a lot of times on a Christmas menu, not usually for Thanksgiving, but then if there were parties, different types of parties, ice cream is there, but it's not something that people have weekly at this time. And I sort of like, why do you think that is, you guys? And they're like, oh, they don't have any freezers. It's like, yeah, they don't have any freezers. And I was like, has anybody ever made ice cream, cranking it? And usually, occasionally, students are like, oh, yeah. And they're like, oh, it was a lot of work to make that ice cream. And I want to do this maybe next year. One of my friends has an old ice cream maker, and I want to actually bring it into class and have the students make the ice cream. All right, so how thinking about what makes those things special, and then trying to find a recipe. And Julie's great because she has the students go through the cookbooks, and then she says to them, most of these are digitized now, and you can search at them. And so then we do that process, but physically holding the books that are 100 years old, I think, is a meaningful experience, although frustrating for some of the students. So then they find a recipe and say, okay, what ingredients are in the recipe? And so this is the Waldorf Salad recipe that's actually from a cookbook that was done by the Ladies' Aid Society here in Ann Arbor, and this was the second printing in 1904. And if anybody wants a really fun read, Mrs. Angel, like Mrs. President Angel, wrote the introduction to parts of this, and it's really fun to see her talking about serving and things like that, giving recommendations on how sanitary your household should be. But it has celery in it, it has good eating apples, it has walnuts in it, and then you mix them together with a dressing. Oh, this one actually has mayonnaise, so I don't know if that's prepared mayonnaise. And then often they're put on lettuce. So then I say to the students, okay, now you know some of the ingredients in Waldorf salad. And besides with these recipes, you also need to think about how much work to make these items. And so we also look at the recipes. So this is again from the Ann Arbor Cookbook, and this is the improved sunshine cake recipe. And sunshine cake was one of the cakes that was specified. And so I know you can read a little bit of it, but I just want to point out, sift flour 5 times, and then sift the sugar too. Oh my goodness, what a lot of work. And then if you go down, you can also see that they're talking about beating 7 egg whites. No electric mixers. So I'm like saying to the students, have you seen those crank things that you can mix the eggs with? And then make them very, very stiff. And then as you go down, it's also talking about, well, if your oven gets a little too hot, you should reduce the temperature. And you can do that if it's a wood range. But it's kind of hard to do that if it's a coal range. So the students can think about how much work and labor went into prepare that food that's on the menu. So I said, okay, you're thinking about table, now we're thinking about preparation. Now let's think about where the food's coming from, because that's the process that I really want you to think about. And so I asked them the question, what's available from local farms? And I hand them a seasonality guide for local produce now, because what is seasonally available now and what can be stored now is the same as it was 100 years ago. And the lovely thing about living in Michigan now is we have the extended winter season through the hoop houses. Well, here in Ann Arbor, there were actually lots of greenhouses too. So I think people were able to grow lettuce through a good chunk of the winter here. That's my suspicion. All right, so here's the participatory part of this lecture. So which things on here would have been seasonally available in February when this banquet was being served? Shout them out. Chicken would have been available, yeah. So, and I'm thinking from local farms, from potatoes, yep. Apples for the Waldorf salad, yep. Potentially cheese, because there was a lot of dairy here in Ann Arbor. So if they were making the ice cream, they could have had the milk for the ice cream too. And maybe celery, if it's stored long enough. So the point of all this is then that there's actually a lot on this menu that could have come from local farms here in Ann Arbor, and there were lots of small, diverse local farms in the Ann Arbor area in the early in the early 1900s. The other thing that I like to do is actually try to show the students some of the records of what the farms were producing. And again, I found a couple farm accounting books in the Bentley Library, and I've only begun to scratch the surface on what I think is probably a wealth of farm records that are out there somewhere. But this is an example of one of them from Allen Farm, and I think this one's up in Whitmore Lake area. But it just lists all the things by the months that were being sold. This one's in 1903, but we have bulls and we have calves and we have lambs and we have chickens and we have veal. And so I say to the students, yeah, see all this, what the farms are producing. And so the point really is that we can celebrate the local food system that was here in Ann Arbor 100 years ago. And I think thriving and doing pretty well, even though I can't say I know that they purchased from this farm. We don't know that, but at least we can infer that farms were producing these things that could have then been purchased for U of M students to eat. I want to show you one other menu item because I think it's important to also show the importance of fresh fruits and vegetables on the menu. And this is one that my students looked at this year. And it's from May. And mulligatawny soup is a soup with curry in it. It also has apples and onions and things like that. But when the students first found it, I was like, I don't know what it is, but you're going to find out. But I want to point out that it's May, so we can think about some other things that are available. And I love this wording right here, early June peas. And I think that meant fresh peas instead of canned peas. And the other thing that's interesting is they decided to have strawberry shortcake. And strawberries weren't quite available here in Ann Arbor yet. They're a June berry. But we started talking about, well, it probably wouldn't be that far to ship the strawberries via train from farms down south. And in May, when people are craving fresh fruit, those strawberries would have been a treat on that banquet menu. All right, so I have the students do the research. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So might you not have canned strawberries or strawberry jam?
Or strawberry preserves? It's possible, and I can't say, but this is actually that banquet menu that I showed you before. That's a fairly fancy small banquet. And so I think there might be treating the guys to fresh strawberries. But you're right, I can't say either way if it was strawberry preserves. But to have strawberry shortcake, I think of that with fresh strawberries on it, especially if you're going to have nice ice cream with it too. So again, it's sort of inferring what's going on, but they clearly were marking the fresh peas on this. So the students are doing this research, and I asked them to do it fairly fast because we're trying to cover the food system from over 100 years ago to what we're doing today. So they do actually a pretty good job in about 6 weeks worth of time, and you can read their research because we put together a website. So we share it, and it's actually been a really lovely way for me to prepare for this because I could just pull up, oh, what's the most common? When are the banquets most common? And I really like this because it also forces students to think about how to communicate with a general public, how to share out their research, and how to organize their thoughts in a pretty consistent way. Now, it's freshmen, and there's some issues with things, but in general, they do a really nice job sharing out the information. So you can see, take a look at it if you're interested. So I also asked the students this year about their impressions about the food that they'd researched and things like that. And one of the students looked at me and said, "I'm really glad I live now." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because I don't have to think about seasonality, and I can have anything whenever I want it." I said, "Okay, that's fair, and that's, we do live in this amazing world where we can get strawberries any time of the year, but they don't taste as good as the fresh ones." But then what happens is, because this was a bicentennial class, I actually got a lot of buy-in from other people at the university, and M Dining said to me, "Yeah, we'll make the stuff for you. We'll make banquet items for you." And so this is what I have the students do is go through and pick out foods that they'd like to try. And then I also talk to the chefs, and they pick out some things that they'd like to try. And this is John Marucci, who's unfortunately left the university, but he worked with me the first couple years of the project. And he's getting ready to serve chicken fricassee, which was on the menu last year, which was great. This is the menu from this year. And the students were like, "There's no way we're eating tomato aspic." And I was like, "But the chef wants to fix it." And I said, "So you need to be respectful that the chefs have taken this time to do this for you." And if you haven't been into South Quad, they've got actually a teaching kitchen in there, and so that's where we do this. And this year, what happened is the chef who worked with us, Dave, who's the sous chef at South Quad, Chef Dave, he said to my students, they actually on their own walked up to him and said, "Can we help in any way?" And he said, "Yeah, you're serving. So here's what you need to do." So these are 4 of the students who are serving with the mulligatawny soup, and then we had the chicken timbales back here and the steak, and then we have different types of tomatoes, and then my favorite was this orange ice. It was so good, and it's just orange juice and lemon juice and mixed together with a lot of sugar syrup and then just frozen. And what I loved about Chef Dave is he really wanted to present it like it was at the banquet, even though it was in this dining hall thing. So he made a few things as it would have been served. And this one, he was so insightful because when the students just dished it up, it was starting to melt immediately. So having it on that ice would have kept it in this really nice way. And then he made little tiny tomato aspect for the students to try, but he also made a bigger one so he could present it, and I think his staff got to eat it that way. And I did get a couple students to try the tomato aspect, which I had some too, and one of the staff looked at me, the dining staff said, "It's just like Bloody Mary Jell-O shot without the alcohol." And I thought that was a really great description of what it was. So, anyway, so we serve this at South Quad, and it's not only for us. The chefs actually cook for 200. And so I'm usually standing there doing my mom thing. "Hey, this is my class, and we did historic research, and come try some of this stuff." But then the students were also charged with talking to people, and they were really proud of getting a couple students to try the tomato aspect there. All right, so that's what I do for class, but over the last 2 years, I've noticed some interesting trends. So I just want to share a few of those trends with you now. And now we're getting to the part of the title. We've already done the caramel ice cream, but this is one of the banquet menus that really surprised me a lot. And the Sphinx Society was one of those small secret societies here at the University of Michigan that was very focused on junior men as part of the literary class. And of course, because it was called the Sphinx Society, there was a lot of overlay with Egypt. Their head person was considered the pharaoh. And this autumn mummification, I think, actually is the initiation ceremony that's going on. So this one's in November of 1912. And this is what the banquet menu looks like. So you open it up, and it's the two sides of the pyramid there. And I'm going to show you the menu, and it'll just be one side of the opening, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to read it. So what this really got me to thinking about was how much these banquets were part of these clubs establishing their identity. And I've seen this in other banquet menus that the students haven't researched. There was a fraternity that has it's a pre-law kind of training, and they also put that into their banquet. And of course, because the banquet's about food, this was the description on the banquet menu. And so the first thing is nectarized crème de tomate, which I think is cream of tomato soup. And I think they picked cream of tomato soup because it's red. And thinking, I actually, when I found this menu, I emailed it to the Egyptologists that are friends of mine on campus, Terry Wolfong and Janet Richards, and I was like, what do you think's going on here, you guys? What about Egyptian food? And they said in 1912, people wouldn't have known much about Egyptian food, and this is prior to King Tut being found. So Egypt and the Middle East and biblical things would have all gotten meshed together. And you can see this in the fish being talked about here, and then the inflamed lamb a la Moses. You can see the sort of biblical references coming in. But the students were like, what's lily stalks? And what's emerald drops? So I've introduced you to what banquet menus look like now. So what do you think lily stalks might be? I think so too. And as John, my husband, pointed out to me today, that this is not lily like the plant, which is only spelled with one L in the middle. It's lily with two L's, so I don't know if it's making some reference to a woman too, or if they're as bad at spelling as I am. Emerald drops, what do you think emerald drops are? Olives, yeah, exactly. So, so we've got the soup, we've got the cold starters, we've got the meat in here, and then we're getting down here, and oops, it got cut off, but pounded Murphys. What do you think those are?
Mashed potatoes.
Mashed potatoes. And it's so interesting to think about that wording in the early 1900s, because just coming off a lot of those stereotypes of Irish people that were so common in the late 1800s in particular. And then the peas over here, I think that means canned peas. I think it means canned peas. I am not sure what spiced bulrushes, etc. is, but it could be asparagus. I don't know how they would have been spicing them. I have no idea what frost a la Kazut is, except that's the ice cream place, so maybe that's what that is. And pastries or a la hunk, that, and actually it says pasties, I think. So I think it's a big piece of cake. And then tannin juice, my daughter was like, is that wine? I was like, nah, I think it's probably the coffee or tea on there. But this is so interesting for me to just see food being used as creating club identity also. And there are several clubs, several organizations that are doing these sorts of things. So this year I challenged myself to start thinking about this from 1910 to 1920 in a slightly different way. And part of it was inspired by last fall with all the news stories about the ending of World War I 100 years before. And the other thing, when I first started doing this research, I was so grateful to the Bentley to have digitized versions of the Michigan Daily. And so I'd started to look for menus in the Michigan Daily, and I kept coming across all these menus from World War I, and I was like, I want to push this a little bit. And it's a really interesting theme that I'm starting to explore with the students a little bit. So as many of you know, during World War I, as the US got into World War I, the US Food Administration started talking to the general population about conserving food. And so we're really promoting meatless and wheatless days, and this one's porkless. There were some that they were conserving sugar as well. And it's sort of changed throughout the year and a half that the US was part of World War I, based on what the needs were in Europe, what food was needed over there. So it wasn't always meatless and wheatless, but wheat actually is a fairly common theme. And so one of the things that's interesting here at Michigan is that the students are jumping on this right away. They're really excited about being supportive and doing their patriotic duty for the war efforts. And this is just a headline from the Michigan Daily in October of 1917. And there's articles, there starts to be articles at this time talking about how the fraternities and sororities are getting on to asking for 1 or 2 days a week, not having meat or not having wheat as part of the menu. There's a variety of substitutes that the US Food Administration is putting out, eat more beans, eat more chicken instead of eating the beef, that sort of thing. And the daily articles keep going on and talking about the law students have joined in, and they go to interview people at Martha Cook, which was one of the only dorms on campus at the time, and so asking the people there about what they're serving, and they're like, well, we don't have specific days, but we always have rye bread alternatives. But it's like the students are out there driving this. We need to do this. And the other thing is the menus are being posted so that boarding houses, if the students are asking, the boarding houses can then follow those menus. So I started to wonder, especially for this talk, is what was going on with the banquets? Was that part of what they were thinking about with the banquets? And so this is May of 1918. I know you can't read this very well, so I've written it out. So the conservation menu for Saturday, which is the day that most of the banquets were, was baked potato, mutton, spinach with eggs, and chocolate pie. What was interesting during this time is the menus were really focused on conserving wheat in particular. Meat wasn't an issue. There was actually a lot of beef on the rest of the week for that menu. And so let's go back to this Alpha Chi Sigma menu. And what you can see is that there's still a fair amount of meat on there, or a fair amount of wheat on here. But the chefs and I had a really interesting conversation about picking strawberry shortcake. And would that have been a cake option that not only could highlight that potentially fresh fruit, but could be using less wheat? And I'm not sure, but the other thing is that these banquets were special occasions. And so maybe by also being part of these food conservation movements on campus, that this food on the banquet menu was even more special for those students during World War I. But the other thing that's really intrigued me is the messaging that's on the World War I Food Administration conservation efforts. And this is one of the very popular posters where it says, buy food with a thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local, serve just enough, use what's left, and don't waste it. And guess what? This is exactly some of the same goals that M Dining has put forward as part of their sustainability movements. So eat less meat. There's substitutes out there. It's too much. It's a high carbon footprint. Purchase local. U of M Dining has a goal of purchasing 20% of the food that's served on campus from within a 250-mile radius of Ann Arbor by the year 2025. And then they're doing amazing things with reducing waste and composting and things like that. And that's what we're talking about now in class, is the sustainability efforts that are happening here on this campus. And the students haven't seen this connection yet, but that's what I'm going to do the last day of class, is say, look, 100 years ago, people were eating local. They were making these decisions, but it was a patriotic effort But oh my gosh, there are so many more people on the planet now, and we need to be thinking this way once again. So this project would not have been possible with lots of help. So I just put everybody up there. Frank Turchin, most of you know Cinda and Julie. Frank Turchin is the head executive chef at U of M Dining, who is so wonderful. Anytime I go in and say, Frank, I got this idea, he's like, okay, Lisa, we'll do it. LSNA Technology was really helpful at putting the website together. And my students, they push me all the time to be thinking about different ways to get them involved in research, and herd them like cats to different places on campus, but they really are rising to the occasion. So thank you all very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
If you have questions, we really would appreciate it if you come up and use the mic so that we can capture the questions adequately for the recording.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk.
You're welcome.
My question is, I assume these banquets are sort of special occasions. What did people eat on a daily basis, and where did they eat? Did they eat at home, or in boarding houses, restaurants, or dining halls, or whatever? What were their menus like?
That is an excellent question, and I have been focused so much on the banquet menus. The everyday foods are interesting because the Ann Arbor Cookbook lists those, the sort of menus for everyday things. They don't have quite so many things on them, but a lot of the main dishes are actually similar. Like veal loaf was commonly served, roasted chicken, things like that. The banquets, it really seems to be the starters, those cold things, and then the desserts. The desserts are more plentiful than at the banquets than you would see in other on sort of everyday things. But I've been surprised with some of the menus that are like in the Ann Arbor Cookbook. But Mrs. Angel's introduction is so interesting because you can see her trying to write that introduction for like somebody who doesn't have help in their household. But you can tell she has help in her household. And when I look at all these things that are on the banquet menu, on the regular menus, I'm like, oh my gosh, how did you have time to make all this? In terms of the students, most of them are living at this time in boarding houses because they're the first dorms on the U of M campus after the initial period of students coming to campus, but the first dorms are Martha Cook and Betsy Barber, and they're not built until 1915. In April, there's menus from Martha Cook up here up at the Bentley now, right?
We just process, like today, finished processing, a beautiful new collection that has year-by-year scrapbooks for Martha Cook dorm.
Wow!
It's great.
Oh, so exciting!
And so it would have, I'm thinking about that. I think one of the ones I looked at today was from the era of the war. So you could look at, did Martha Cook change its menus?
Right, that would be really exciting. So a lot of the students are eating at boarding houses. Occasionally the scrapbooks will have menus from restaurants, especially if they went for special dinners. I've seen a couple Thanksgiving dinner menus from restaurants in the scrapbooks as well. So they're a wealth of information. Thank you for asking. So the other thing that's interesting about the daily at this time is this is also a time where food and sanitation is starting to be an issue too. So I haven't delved into it at all, but there's a big thing about do you need to pasteurize your milk? Which, given that there were so many small-scale dairy farms around here, I think that was starting to be an issue. So that's when you start getting the farms sort of aggregating their milk and the bigger growing dairies in town to do that pasteurization. So there's a lot of things about thinking about how sanitary the boarding houses are. And the university at this time also starts keeping track of the boarding houses. They've been doing it for a while, but really keeping track of the health of the students in the boarding houses also. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. This is just fascinating. I'm just curious, especially since the daily is now digitized, Do you have any idea of how the students are reacting to all this food? Is it too much chicken? Do they think the banquets are great?
I don't know for this time period, but what I will tell you is I have used the daily quite a bit, and actually the Bentley records, for the little tiny bit of the transition to industrialization that I do in the class, because we start in the early 1900s, and then very rapidly I talk about the industrialization of the food system, and then we come to today. I need to do that to talk about why sustainability is so important today. And there are some great daily articles about, one, the U of M being very proud of its industrialized food service, and that's developing in the early 1950s. 1956, the students in South and West Quad riot because they're so pissed off about the food. I mean, literally, they are in the street between those two dorms, and some of the accounts are that there's 1,000, and it's all guys, because that's who was living in those dorms at the time, 1,000 guys in the street complaining about the food, in particular in South Quad. And the other thing that comes out very strongly in this class is what a voice students have here at the University of Michigan. And it's clear from a little bit from the daily articles, but there's the records of the reports in the Bentley Library about that they realized they needed to do something about food service. And so they went from only offering 1 meat option a day to 2 meat options a day. And one of the reasons that was important is because sometimes they were offering like ham 3 days in a row. And the Jewish students, that wasn't great for them. So now I think it's okay. I'll take that back. The one complaint that I've seen is from a student who was working in some of the boarding houses, and they were talking about how they were not getting enough food because the other people were being served, and then they were not getting enough food. So it was more about getting enough food rather than the quality of the food. But we haven't looked at that because I've been so focused on the banquet menus, but that's an interesting question. And something I'd love to pick up if, like I said, I do this crazy thing where this is a 6-week project, so we don't have a lot of time to put it in a broader context. So I am liking this picking themes, and Cinda and I have been talking about that next year is the 100th anniversary of suffrage, women's suffrage, and also the 105th anniversary of women being admitted into the University of Michigan. So we may have a women's banquet theme going on next fall. So I'm excited about that. And I was thinking when I first started this project that the men would focus on the banquet menus from the men's scrapbooks, and the women, they don't do that. They don't care. They're just happy doing any of them, so which is interesting. Yeah?
Have any idea what the portion sizes look like?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't have any idea what the portion sizes would have looked like. I am assuming that, especially on those smaller banquets, especially for the guys, there was probably lots of food for them to eat, but I don't know. I also don't know how that women's league, one that I put up the couple years before where it was 600 people, wow, that without refrigerators and out electricity to make all that stuff, that must have been a huge production to do that. And originally, I think the first banquet menu that we've looked at from the Women's League was a dinner, and that may have been the 600-person one. And the last two that I've looked at that are a little bit later in time are luncheons. So there may have been a strategic shift there. I'm not sure. The other interesting piece of trivia is that all the veal has been on the women's menus, the menus from women's meals, which I thought was interesting. So, and veal at that time is not like we think of veal. It was just a calf before it turned a year old. And because there was so much dairy in the Ann Arbor area, it makes sense that there would be a lot of veal. So. All righty, well, thank you very much, and I hope you're inspired. The recipes are on the website, so if you want to try some, and not all of them are that complicated as that cake was. So I would not be sifting flour 5 times. So.
Lisa, thank you very much.
Thank you.